It's a marathon, isn't it, as you mentioned.
As a really daft example, if you say you're out of shape, going to the gym once, you ain't going to be in shape. And you're also not going to see the results straight away. So if you want to improve, get on top of your backlog, you've got to commit to getting on top of it and getting yourself fit and healthy. So you won't see the results right away, and you have to keep consistent and disciplined at doing it.
Hi everyone, I'm glad you're here. This podcast is all about modern day engineering and maintenance challenges, and most importantly, the role of IT to make the workplace easier, safer, and better. It's a space to share insights, have meaningful conversations, and find practical solutions together. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you find value in our discussions and enjoy our content. Colin, thank you very much for joining the session. How are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent, thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciated.
Thanks, Colin. I've known you for a good number of years now. You always strike me as somebody who is very passionate about engineering and maintenance related problems. Let's start with an introduction, who you are, what you do, what you are passionate about, and what your goals are in professional life around what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So, Colin Robson, as you said at the intro. So, I'm the director and co-founder of SRCN Solutions. In terms of what I'm passionate about, it's really just helping organisations get stuff done. So, since I've been involved in maintenance and work management for scarily approaching 20 years now, started as basically a maintenance focal point for an organisation, which means I'm responsible for all the maintenance being done offshore, trying to make sure it's prepared, scheduled, executed. And in part of that role, I got involved in a lot of maintenance strategy reviews. So you're talking about what it is you intend to do to maintain the equipment. And I found myself attending one or two of them it felt like every 6 months. So we kept revising what we intended to do, but it struck me we were never that good at getting it done. So it felt like we were just revising our to-do list, but not actually doing anything. And I got a bit obsessed with actually getting stuff done. So that old quote of strategy without execution's delusion. There's like, it matters what you do, not what you say you'll do. So I basically got a bit obsessed about how do people and organisations get things done. And whilst we call it work management, that's essentially what I'm passionate about is if you say you're going to do something, how do you make sure you do it? So that's what I do, what I get geeky about and what gets me talking fast. So you've picked a topic I'm passionate about for us to talk about today. So if I talk fast, somebody wave at me because otherwise I'll just be off.
Yeah, fantastic. I think you touched upon a number of different areas, which I'm very intrigued. And as always, as you talked about the work management process and strategy reviews. So the work that you do, Colin, before we straight away jump into this particular topic that I want to cover today, is it limited to certain industries, or do you prefer certain type of industries, or is it any asset heavy industry given the opportunity?
Any asset heavy given the opportunity. So if your industry is dependent on maintaining physical equipment to produce your product, work management applies. So it's how you intend to maintain that equipment, how you get that maintenance carried out, and what you do if something breaks. So if you're dependent on physical machinery to produce an outcome, work management can help you. Historically, we've been oil and gas predominantly, just because that's where we started. However, we're on a big push just now to branch out from there, because I think we can help basically any industry. One of the things about oil and gas is it's quite high margin. I mean, that fluctuates around with oil price, obviously, but predominantly it's quite a high margin industry. But what we do, I think, would add significant benefit to quite a lot of lower margin industries. So we're keen to reach out to them and see if we can assist. So we're talking to places like even the NHS, clear power from energy from waste, all these different markets to try and really help them. So it's industry agnostic, what we do, essentially.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Right, moving on to topic for today, which is the backlog. I'm sure you must have worked on this number of different times, number of different clients, number of different contexts. But let's start things in the right place. So let's define what a backlog is.
I'm laughing. I'm just so glad you started there because very few people do, and they throw out the term backlog, and it's one of these frustrating terms that doesn't have a universal definition, so we've got to be careful that we're making sure we're talking about the same thing. So backlog, in the terms that we typically refer to it in oil and gas, using the OUK definition that I helped write, is it's any maintenance that is open beyond the point the organisation originally intended to execute it. So if it's a piece of preventive maintenance or planned maintenance, I'll use a car as an example. You've got to do a 10,000 mile service. If you've gone beyond 10,000 miles and you have not done that maintenance, then that maintenance is in backlog. And if it's corrective maintenance, so if you've got your brakes are beginning to squeal and you think they're going to fail catastrophically within 2,000 miles, that's quite a stretch. If you're at 2,001 miles, then that is in backlog because it went beyond the point you originally thought that it would need done. So backlog is everything open beyond the point you originally intend to do it. There are other definitions. So some organisations, particularly manufacturing, but also some oil and gas organisations for corrective maintenance, will refer to backlog as being all live work. So if you've got defect maintenance, all of your live defect maintenance can be considered backlog in some places. But we are trying not to use that term. For the purpose of today, it'll be any maintenance open beyond the point you originally intended to do it.
Okay. Right. Just to touch upon that then. So you said beyond the point that it's originally intended to be done. So in energy industry, there is this day called LAFD, latest allowable finish days. Are you referring to that or a different?
Essentially that. So yeah, so the term you use is an SAP term, I guess it would be.
Okay.
There's also the target finish date used. We've also saw latest allowable completion date. So in the OEUK literature that we wrote, we actually refer to it as the original key risk date, just because the term LAFD isn't universal. So it's as variable as backlog. So we refer to it as the original key risk date. And the supporting date to that is the latest key risk date, if that makes sense. That we can touch on just quickly. So if you first generate a piece of work, it'll come with two dates. It'll have the original key risk date and it'll have its latest key risk date. Your original date is the date you intend to do it. If you go beyond this date, you should reassess the work. So you say, I haven't done it by that date. When do I have to do this before a negative consequence will occur? You assess it, take an in-consequence likelihood mitigation, and you set a new date. And this becomes your latest key risk date. So if you're beyond your original and you are in backlog, it's then either assessed or unassessed, depending where your latest key risk date is, if that makes sense. So the latest key risk date is what we use in the OUK guidance and in other places, but that is essentially what you'd refer to as LAFD.
Right. Okay. I to be honest, I didn't know about the key risk date. Thanks for pointing that out.
It's a term we coined, and it is in the OUK guidance, but it's not universally accepted. So we are trying to push that out there to get a common understanding. It's the terms that we are trying to get more commonly used, so we all know we're talking the same things.
Yeah. Okay. So you talked about partly how to address the backlog in terms of risk assessment and things like that, which I'll come to next. But just to be perfectly clear, what that means is that I have a work order in my hand where the let's call it it is in the future, that doesn't fall into backlog. That is almost like a work that I have to do, but it does not form the backlog.
That's correct. So some places will call it forlog, but no, unless it's beyond its original key risk date, it is not yet in backlog by the definition we're using today.
Okay. Right. So I'll ask the obvious question, right? Without asking that there's no moving forward. So why do companies have to care about backlog?
So in essence, I'll talk about the oil and gas example because it's the easiest one, because it's one I'm most familiar with. And we'll talk about it from a preventive maintenance perspective. So planned maintenance are your maintenance strategies. But when you install an oil and gas rig in the North Sea, you'll go to the regulator, the health and safety executive, and say, this is everything we will do to ensure there is not a major accident occurs on this installation. So it's how you justify it being there and you make sure that it's safe. So that this is all your safety critical equipment or safety and environmentally critical equipment. So you go to the regulator and say, we're going to put this there, and here's our safety case, our case for safety, how we justify that we're able to keep that asset safe and manage that risk of major accident to be as low as reasonably practicable. A LARP is the term that you'll hear. You'll then identify all the equipment that you've got to have in place to make that installation deliver what you've said it will do in the safety case. So all the safety equipment that you say will be there to get people off the installation will detect any failure of major equipment. will keep all your oil and gas and your hydrocarbons in the pipe, all of that equipment. You'll define the performance standards for those types of equipment. So you'll say, for this pipe, to keep the hydrocarbon within it, then it has to meet this minimum wall thickness. For the fire pump to deliver enough water to meet this level of flow at the heli deck, that'll have to meet this head and flow. So that's your performance standards. You'll then develop your safety critical maintenance to ensure that equipment can meet those performance standards. So we will test the fire pump once a week to make sure that it runs and it produces the head and flow required. And we'll give it a major overhaul every X number of years, because by that point, we think it'll have degraded to the point it will no longer deliver on its requirements. So your strategies will be at those frequencies. We'll test it weekly and say we'll overhaul it every 6 years for ease. Backlog means you haven't tested it weekly. So you've said we'll test it every week and you haven't, which means you're no longer able to demonstrate the fire pump will work in line with how you've said you will demonstrate it to the regulator. Or if it's maintaining it, you've went beyond the 6 years and you are no longer able to say that will work beyond the point we've said we have to maintain it or it will fail. So those two things are backlog. You've went beyond the point you intended to do this maintenance to ensure you're meeting the objectives that you've laid out. So the reason you should care about backlog is you ain't doing what you say you'll do. So for a car, if you say I'm going to change out my brakes after 20,000 miles and you're at 20,000 miles, you're going to check your brakes before you go out and driving it with family. If you're at 24,000 miles, way beyond the service, you're going to start getting nervous. So that's why you need to care about backlog, because it's beyond the point you've said, I have to do this or a bad thing will happen.
Right. Okay. So it literally is because you are pushing the equipments beyond a certain point without taking care of them properly. So more the backlog, you expose your whole operation to risk. That's what it is, isn't it?
100%. You've deviated from what you said you'd have to do to meet a LARP as low as reasonably practicable, which is what you basically said to the regulator you will do. We will do this to keep this safe. So ultimately, if you go beyond that point, then you're no longer at a LARP, arguably, because you're not maintaining the equipment the way you say you would. Now, this is a really simplistic example. You obviously, if the pump doesn't run as long, then you could say, well, we haven't met that point, and that's what your risk assessment does. But in essence, yeah, you're not maintaining it in the way you intended to ensure it does its primary function.
Right. Okay. So before I get to the risk assessment piece, so I think you took the example from oil and gas and energy, but principally it got to be the same for any industries.
Yeah. So if you've designed a widget making factory and you say we need this machine to run to produce 20 widgets an hour for us to make our profit, and for us to ensure that it does that, we're going to overhaul it every year. If you don't overhaul every year, then you can't guarantee it will run next week in order to meet your 20 widgets. So it's the same thing. Essentially, your output and your forecasting targets, if you're depending on physical equipment to produce your product, oil and gas, widgets, you're saying we have to maintain it in this way for us to keep making our widgets. If you don't maintain it in that way, there's no guarantee you can continue to make your widgets. So it's any industry if you're dependent on equipment.
Yeah. It's just that I believe only is that so in energy, you're more prone to talk about health and safety because of obvious reasons. But when it comes
100%.
to manufacturing, you talk about, I believe, production losses and maybe depending on the industry, if it's consumables, consumer safety and things like that, I believe. Okay.
Oh, 100%. So even in oil and gas, you'll separate the maintenance into your safety critical maintenance. So that's all the stuff you have to do to keep people safe. But you'll have production critical maintenance, which is this is what we have to do to make sure we keep producing. So you've got the business side of things, which is why you do the safety side of things, is to keep doing the business side of things. So yeah, 100%. It could be anything you're producing. This is how you ensure you meet your organisational strategy and intent, is by doing the maintenance. And if you don't do the maintenance as described, you should really look and go, how do we know it's going to keep functioning as we intend to?
Okay. So Colin, you talked about so when treating the backlog, you kind of pick the backlog up and then try to risk assess it. If you take different work orders, you risk assess them, and then elevated risks, you set the new deadlines and then start working towards that, right? So moment you do that treatment, does that particular work order or set of work orders come out of the backlog to follow?
No, so that's a big point of debate. No, it doesn't. So ultimately, what you want to record as an organisation is how far you've deviated from your original intent. And you want to do that for a number of reasons. It's how much additional risk are we carrying over and above what we intended when we first done our strategies? How effective are we executing our maintenance? It's helpful to know that. So basically, under the oil and energy UK definitions that we helped them write, and these are relatively new, they're about a couple of years old. If it goes beyond its original key risk date, it is forever in backlog. There is then two types of backlog, assessed or unassessed. If you haven't reassessed it and the latest key risk date is behind you in time, that's unassessed backlog. You don't know when the bad thing may happen. If you've deferred it or assessed it and moved that latest key risk date ahead of you, then it is in assessed backlog. So the lesser of two evils is assessed backlog, if you like. You'd rather have no backlog at all. The lesser of two evils is assessed backlog because you've looked at it and reassessed it based on your current understanding. What really shouldn't be acceptable for organisations is to have unassessed backlog, because in effect you don't know when this thing will fail and what the consequence will be. So you're surrendering your outcome to hope, essentially, and hope's not a strategy, to quote Vince Lombardi.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. That makes a lot of sense, actually, because that is something which bugged me. It's like you do risk assessment, then you're still not out of the risk until you execute it, isn't it? That makes a lot of
100%.
sense.
So risk assessment is not risk elimination. It's a hole that again, talking about oil and gas, it's a hole that industry's fallen down in the past, is they would defer something, take it out of backlog, and there was far less concern about it historically. And that created a lot of disquiet for a number of ways, which is like the workforce in particular felt it was being fudged. So things had just been taken out of backlog and hidden, and the numbers made to look good when performance isn't any better. So you're looking good instead of being good. And it's still a legacy that the industry tries to shake off. There's still a stigma about deferring. And it got so bad that people started thinking deferrals were a bad thing. So re-risk assessing was a bad thing because it's hiding it. And it got that they were just leaving it in backlog to make it visible. So excuse all the air quotes, but they were really quite damaging thought paths for a while. So you'd have companies with ever-increasing backlog. They wouldn't reassess it to keep it visible under the guise of doing the right thing, but they weren't reassessing that risk. So they were actually trying to make it visible, massively increasing the risk because they didn't really understand it. So yeah, it's vitally important that you move it and you've reassessed it, but you still count it for a number of reasons. And if you don't count that, then you're not being transparent with yourself, which is the biggest risk.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I
should say just quickly, this may be pedantry, but you've said a couple of times that to sort the backlog or to rectify the backlog, you reassess it. That's just, so the analogy I was using is backlogs like your bath's overflowing and the floor's soaking wet and the water on the floor is your backlog. Deferring it's just mopping it up. It doesn't fix the problem, if you like. So the problem still exists. You're moving it, but the problem's still there. So it's not really a fix. You're just dealing with the water on the floor, but it's going to come back if you don't fix the cause of the symptom.
That's a great analogy, Colin. Spot on. Are there anything called acceptable backlog? The reason I'm asking this question is a few different times, a few different places I've seen that, for example, 120 hours or 150 hours per technician is the acceptable backlog for a company. Is there such thing like that?
Not really, is the short answer. So I would love there to be, because it would make my life easier, because everywhere we go asks us. So one of the figures that used to always kick about was between 6 to 8 weeks worth of backlog is the ideal volume of backlog. It's best practice or top quartile or whatever one of those terms you want to use. Now, unfortunately, that was a legacy from that previous definition of backlog that I said, which was all live corrective work. And some come from the school of thought that if you've got no corrective work, you're over maintaining. So nothing's ever failing, so you're doing too much preventive maintenance and it's not optimal. You're also unable to really plan and schedule effectively if you have no corrective maintenance and it's coming too early. So they came up with the figure of 6 to 8 weeks as optimal. That unfortunately got picked up as people's understanding for the term backlog that we are discussing today, which is open beyond the point you originally intended to do it. Now, essentially, if you're going to have an ideal world, you wouldn't have any backlog. You'd be absolutely executing your work in line with your original intent. In reality, you may not be able to do that, particularly for assessed backlog. So if you're looking at work that you originally thought it was a good idea to do it, but you're now 6 months further down the line, you'd looked at a vibrating pump and you thought that's going to fail in 6 weeks. And then you look at it again in 6 weeks and it's no worse. You go, well, actually, that might go another 6 weeks. Moving that into backlog isn't really increasing your risk that significantly, because when you reassess something, we have to accept you're taking a punt. You're making a guess. You're trying to predict the future. you're ultimately saying, I think that will fail then, which is almost impossible for humans to do. So flipping a coin, you know the probability of heads or tails is 50-50. You still can't tell what one's coming up next with absolute certainty. So when you're risk assessing something, you're always giving your best estimate at the time. Having something that's being backlogged immediately and reassessing it into assessed backlog isn't immediately bad. However, you'd rather not have any. But in terms of setting a target on it, if you've got a 40-year-old asset that is used to produce 120,000 barrels and now produces 20,000 barrels, and you probably don't have to maintain all the equipment that's there, and you're running towards COP, it's going to be acceptable for you to have a higher backlog on that installation, provided it's not safety critical and it's being managed well, than it is on a brand new asset, if that makes sense. And the organisational risk appetite can play into this. So one organisation might say, we absolutely will not accept any threat to production, so I want everything maintained in line with the strategy. Other organisations might go, we're actually happy with a little bit of risk to production because it'll save us a little bit of OPEX in the maintenance or whatever. So the target is very dependent on the organisational appetite to risk. And that's the bit that gets a little bit lost, which is you can't really look at another organisation and say, well, they accept 100,000 hours of backlog, so we'll do that. Well, they might have a very different context for that acceptance. They might care less about production loss than you do. So you've really got to look at that and think hard yourselves within an organisation. What do we accept as an acceptable level of essentially risk to our business? So yeah, there isn't really a hard and fast rule. However much we'd all love to have one, because it'd be great to just say a week, and then you can measure, is that enough or is it not? But yeah, it's very subjective, unfortunately.
In your line of business and the work that you have done over the years, Colin, have you met an organization who is having a backlog very close to zero?
No. So if it's zero assessed backlog and unassessed backlog, so absolutely no backlog whatsoever, no. And if I'm ever told that one exists, I would want to look at their figures in quite a lot of detail. So call me a cynic, but if somebody's doing absolutely everything they say they'll do, I'm immediately somewhat skeptical and I'd like to look under the hood.
Yeah, understand. But I personally face this situation. One of the companies that we have worked with in the past, when we have done a sort of an assessment of the organization and the way the maintenance function worked, and in and around SAP, of course, and then there were a lot of things that kind of hinted that there must be a backlog, but they didn't have the reporting and everything in the right way to point towards that. So my question to you is, are there, rather than somebody saying that we have this much of assessed or unassessed backlog, are there symptoms where everything else or some points to having backlog?
Yeah, so it depends. So it really depends what you're measuring. If you're not measuring backlog, the chances are you might have any more advanced KPIs, if that makes sense, because it's such an essential one. So if you don't measure the maintenance you're not doing by the point you said you have to, then it's quite a fundamental KPI to not have. However, there are others. So if you're continually not delivering high schedule attainment, then there's a fairly high percentage chance you're not doing what you say you'll do, which means you're likely to have backlog. Same for plan attainment. Other metrics can be your compliance metrics, but they're driven off the same date. So if you have 100 work orders with their original or latest key risk date in the month, are you doing them by that date? Again, if you've got a high percentage you're not, you're going to have backlog. But to take that measure, you're probably going to be measuring them anyway. If you don't have any metrics, then the chances are you can just look at how reliable and available your equipment is. So if you're continually having failures and you have got maintenance strategies in place, and it's very rare the maintenance strategies are absolutely terrible, like they just wouldn't in some way serve a purpose. So if you're having terrible plant availability and reliability, and you're not tracking backlog and you are executing maintenance, there's a chance you'll not be doing everything you intend to.
Yeah. Okay. What factors, Colin, normally contributes to building a backlog or growing backlog?
So in the simplest terms, your execution capacity is not in line with your work demand. So to use the bathtub analogy again, basically the volume of water you've got coming into the bath isn't exiting out through the drain hole before it pours over the top, to use a simple term. So to then, if you look at that bath example and to try and figure out why do we have water on the floor, there's only a few reasons. One is your drain pipe is too small. So in a workforce example, you don't have enough resources and your drain's too small for the water coming in. The second cause can be your drain pipe's big enough, so you've got enough resource, but you're inefficient, so that your drain line is clogged. So you've got a smaller bore in the middle of the pipe than you should ideally have. Not all the water that's got coming in can get through. So that's your inefficient. And the third cause is you've just got too much coming in, so your tap's too high. So one of those three things, normally a combination of those things, is what normally leads to having backlog. But in essence, it's because you've got more work to do than you're able to execute, in a nutshell.
Right. Do you believe a good reliability engineering function contribute to that to address, well, rather stop backlog from growing?
So yes and no. We think every function that's responsible for maintenance in some way is responsible for the backlog. So whether it's the maintenance organisation has got to make sure its execution capability is efficient enough to execute the strategies as designed, or the reliability function are responsible for looking going, they're working as hard as they can and as efficiently as possible. My strategies are too onerous for them to execute within their constraints. I have to find another way of meeting that intent. Or whether it's the organisation as a whole, which goes, we need to get additional capacity for a short term to execute the backlog. Essentially, every function will have a role to play in how you manage and execute the backlog. But ultimately, yes, the reliability function should be ensuring that the maintenance strategies it designed are as low as possible to meet the intended outcome. So in medicine, they've got a term called the minimum effective dose. So what's the minimum of a drug you have to give someone for it to alleviate their symptoms, if you like? You need the same mindset for maintenance. So what's the minimum of maintenance we can do on that equipment for it to meet its reliability and availability target? And if you're above that, from a reliability engineer designing the strategy perspective, you're placing more of a burden on the asset than you have to, and you need to try and optimize that. So yeah, reliability's got a part to play, and I think they have to work within the given constraints, but they also have to push and try and make sure that there's as much being executed as they can.
You mentioned every function, pretty much scheduling, reliability engineering in the work management cycle has some bearing on the backlog. And in looking at that, do you think there's enough emphasis on the backlog and reduction of backlog and treating the backlog in the right way across the maintenance organizations?
In my experience, no. Maintenance is thought of as a maintenance problem. And normally they look at the maintenance supervision at the work site to deal with maintenance, or they'll look at their support organisation around about them. So typically it's the people responsible for executing the maintenance is where everybody looks at and says, right, your backlog's too high. I personally think that the organisations as a whole have to better understand backlog. So backlog is a symptom of the wider part of your organisation not working effectively. You're not delivering on your intent. And even from a senior leadership level, I think that's something they have to understand. And they have to help diagnose what the problem is, why is backlog coming about, before you can figure out how to fix it, if that makes sense. So are you inefficient? Do you not have enough resource? Are you trying to do too much work? And what we found in the past is senior leadership may not necessarily understand what backlog is per se. So if you're a finance background and you're a CEO, you don't really have to. You just know backlog bad. And what that can lead to is quite an oversimplification of what backlog does or means. So they just say, I want backlog to come down and I want it down by the end of the year. That in itself, unless you're willing to grant additional resource, spend more money, or increase your appetite for risk, it doesn't mean anything. There's a danger that people will start trying and get rid of backlog in the wrong way, which is back to what we were speaking about earlier. So just defer it and throw it ahead of you. Now, if you're still counting that as backlog, which we are now, that actually presents an even bigger problem for people, because ultimately what they used to do was they'd defer it, risk assess it, move ahead. It's no longer backlog and it's hidden. Now, when they count it, they can't do that. So there's a danger that they start doing other things to try and make the number come down if leadership just say that has to come down, and they use the leadership stick to do it. So I think the understanding of what backlog is, where it comes from, and how to resolve it is a really big challenge for a lot of organisations, because you've ultimately got to understand the root cause before you can deal with it and then put it in the right place. So yeah, I think there's numerous parts of the organisation can be responsible for backlog. Is it operations team aren't releasing equipment for you to maintain it? Is it the maintenance team aren't executing efficiently? Is it the reliability team or the maintenance function because the strategies are just too onerous? Is it supply chain because they're not getting the materials in time for you to be able to execute the work? Is it planning because they're prioritizing project work over maintenance work? So it's across the organisation. It's a holistic endeavour to maintain the assets in what's essentially quite a dynamic environment. You've got a lot going on that's not just maintenance. So to just look at maintenance and say backlog's your problem, it's too simplistic. It's the whole organisation is responsible for making sure you deliver your maintenance intent, and that's a large part of what we do is try and identify that and really home in on, right, what's everyone's part in this, not just the mechie supervisor that you're given a doing because he's got 3 guys and 6 guys worth of work. It's all got to balance out.
I think, you touched upon a very important point. That how do you emphasize that? How do you quantify or how put it into financial terms backlog so that the decision makers beyond maintenance can understand? Is there a way, or have you done any exercise in the past, or is it practice in industry where trying to quantify, give a value or a cost to backlog just being there rather than
Yeah, so that
measures?
$1 million question. So the hard part about backlog is it's perversely saving you OPEX in a funny way because you're not doing something that you were going to spend money to do. So the challenge that we often get is how much. So if I reduce my backlog, how much money will I save? Well, actually, if you've got 10,000 hours of backlog, that's 10,000 hours of expenditure you have to make you haven't made yet. And you intended to spend that over the last 5 years, and you haven't. You're basically going to have to spend more money than you were planning to, which is never an attractive thing to come and say to an organisation. And also, what can be difficult with backlog is, again, when I said earlier, you're trying to predict the future. If you don't mean, so start with a simple example. If you're going to do a capital project, if you install this new production line, you'll get an extra X number of widgets at the end of a year. Very transparent to forecast because you can do a start date, number of widgets per day, and forecast it. And if you're 5 days late with that project, widgets per day times 5 days will cost you this much money. So it's really easy to quantify the cost of loss on a project. For maintenance, you'll go in oil and gas, maintain that fire pump, because if you don't, then it'll probably still run and we'll risk assess it and you'll move it. Do you know what I mean? So actually saying that the impact in such a live, specific way of not doing maintenance is really difficult to predict. So it's $1 million question: is that you not doing maintenance is cheaper. To do maintenance will be expensive, and if you do maintenance, what you will get is what you've already got, which is the production you've banked on. So you assume the equipment's going to keep running. So actually getting people to do backlog is quite a hard sell. The way we quantify it is actually not direct on the cost of executing the maintenance, but it is in the cost of running with a backlog. So you have to reassess it. You've got to take onshore engineering time to reassess that work. That will take the first person that raises the deferral, for example, the technical authority that will review it from a technical perspective and say, I agree, that's safe to keep doing. The operations side will say, I agree, that controls the risk. And then the CMMS admin to move the date out. So there's 5 positions involved in a single deferral. Say an hour for each person, just for simple terms for the podcast. Multiply that by 10,000 deferrals, and this is how much you're spending. It's a bit of a roundabout way of doing it, but I can give you an indication of the amount of waste in your organisation. We do the same with schedule attainment. So if you've forecast to do 100 work orders in a week and you do 85, that's 15 work orders that you've got to move. So that's 15 work orders that the scheduler moves out again at 5 minutes a work order. It's then reviewed by the schedule review team. So that's 10 people reviewing those 5 work orders, blah, blah, blah. So you're normally trying to justify the expenditure based on the waste within the process for doing it. It's really difficult to start quantifying and saying, if you don't maintain this, then that pump will fail in 3 weeks and it'll cost you this amount. So trying to do monitoring terms is really quite challenging.
That's a tricky one, isn't it? It's just, as you mentioned, it just... if you don't get that right, then again, you can't explain it to everyone who, sometimes only understand the monetary terms, right? Not the risk of the operation.
I kind of think the concept of it has to change. So if you don't look at maintaining the brakes in your car and say, well, how much money will I get if I maintain those brakes? You go, well, you won't get any money. I can calculate your insurance cost, but you kind of got to walk it back to the principle of the brakes exist so you don't crash into things. Maintenance exists so your equipment doesn't fail and it keeps producing your outcome. So there's kind of the value you get from doing maintenance is the thing that you want to achieve. You'll produce the product. You won't have a major incident. You won't have an environmental impact. But when you do it in monetary terms, which is the way everyone wants to do it, it becomes a bit more abstract, I feel like. It's much harder. So we do it. You can arbitrarily throw figures at it, but it does become really arbitrary.
Okay. So if a company is having a fairly substantial backlog, Colin, and would like to, assess them and then put right strategies in place to come out of it and then keep it contained in an acceptable range, as you could call it, are there any quick wins that they can apply?
Oh, yeah, normally. Excessive backlogs, particularly unassessed backlogs, are normally a symptom of a fairly ineffective work management process. So that there will be a lack of discipline in the process normally. And again, we haven't came across any organisation that's particularly top quartile in that space, because I guess if they were, they wouldn't be engaging with us. But yeah, normally if you start with a high backlog, you'll start by making sure that what's in there is accurate. So that's normally a desktop exercise where you look at it and you go, have we got any duplicates? Is there any work orders that are partially complete that we think's already done? Is there any equipment that's been mothballed, isn't there anymore, but we've still got old work orders against it? So you'd cleanse it initially to get it down to a meaningful level. You'll then normally reassess it. So the way we do it is we literally look at every work order. We don't think there's an easy AI solution for this yet. You look at every work order, you reassess it, and you say, what's the bad thing that will happen if we don't do that? And when's that bad thing likely to happen after any mitigation? And then you'll start getting dates when you do stuff. If you've got a particularly onerous volume of backlog, you would also suggest you implementing a mechanism for saying, what are we just not going to do? So what negative consequence are we willing to accept happen, and then we'll deal with it? So, for example, if you've got isolation valves for a PSV, a pressure relief valve, and you normally change your pressure relief valve out every, say, 6 years for ease, you've just changed it out. You're probably not going to have to do it again for 6 years unless it fails. There's no point in changing out those isolation valves next week, because you're not going to need them for 5 years. So log the fact they don't work, mark them as do not progress, so we're not going to progress this to do the work just yet, and just hold them there and take them out of backlog because you don't intend to do them. So those things will clean up and really get you an accurate depiction of what your backlog is, and what the priority of the work is. Then, depending on the volume and depending on your focus, you can then build schedules based on that and start treating it as a defined scope of works. Build a schedule for the next 6 weeks containing everything you've just reassessed in your backlog, and manage that work very strictly. So almost like a shutdown. So if there's any new work comes up, subject it to a really rigorous break-in process. And make sure that what you've got as a new piece of work is more important than what you've already got there. And manage the schedule. So make sure you are executing this work in line with the schedule that you've built. And then that will slowly begin to build you the capacity to start looking further out, because you'll get on top of the major things. So there are some quick wins. You can begin to look broader. So if you, depending on your organisation and the installation, if you can quickly bring in additional resource, because it's not necessarily needing site competent personnel, you can look to bring in other resources and temporarily upman, get on top of the backlog quickly, and then roll back down to your normal resource levels. Some places will look at putting a campaign structure in place, so you're building in regular periods of increased manning to deal with your backlog, and then they roll back off again. So there's a number of different ways you can do it. In terms of quick wins, there are some, but it really is a marathon, not a sprint. So to permanently eliminate backlog, you've got to change all the things that have existed to cause it in the first place. And that isn't always easy. It's our strategy reviews, getting more efficient, getting more resource. Yeah, these things can take some time.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I like the analogy. It's a marathon, isn't it? As you mentioned.
As a really daft example, if you say you're out of shape, right, going to the gym once, you ain't going to be in shape. And you're also not going to see the results straight away. So if you want to improve, get on top of your backlog, you've got to commit to getting on top of it and getting yourself fit and healthy. So you won't see the results right away, and you have to keep consistent and disciplined at doing it, and then you get results. The quick wins, that's a wee bit like a fat pill, in my view. I view them a bit skeptically, if you like.
Yeah. If a company puts the time and effort and resources to reduce the backlog to a certain level, then what you mentioned is that managing it in the long run in the right way is making sure the work management process works right, schedule attainments is right, and then reliability engineering, and you resource it right as well, right? The whole function.
Yeah, exactly. So you have a mechanism where you can do what you say you'll do at the time you say you'll do it. So that's the right way through from when you identify new work, how do you prioritise it to make sure you're doing it at the right time? You're not just reacting to do it because it's new. how you prepare the work. So you make sure you're robustly capturing all the parts, the services, the materials that you need in order to execute that work. Are you building a schedule that's executable? So you're not just assuming that you've got 9 hours range time a day when you get 6. So you're setting yourself up for failure. An effective and robust work management process means you'll do what you say you'll do, but will also allow a mechanism for reassessment to make sure that if you aren't doing it by that point, then you're robustly assessing it and doing it at the right time. Because there is one thing, I think that there can be a tendency to think that a deferral or a risk assessment or reprioritization is inherently bad. It's a fundamental part of everyday working in operations. Is like your priority 2 today might be priority 4 tomorrow. The world changes and the environment shifts. So I think prioritization is a continuous activity. It's not just a one and done. So once you get your work management process working and you allow for effective reprioritization and you allow for stuff to the capacity to catch back up, then that's how you stay on top of backlog. It's a consistent effort of a robust process.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Such an interesting topic and a conversation, but we are more towards the last couple of questions for today. Do you think, or rather, let me put the question in this way: what do you think the role of a CMMS in terms of getting the visibility to backlog and the help in the companies to alleviate getting deep into it?
It's the single source of truth. I think companies look at the work management process and the CMMS as sometimes separate things, but they're so intertwined that it's impossible to do effective work management if your CMMS is not aligned with your work management process. So if you say, to use your example of obviously your field of expertise, SAP, if your work management system is set up and designed in isolation from your SAP system, so in work management, you've got 7 stages: identify, validate, prepare, schedule, execute, close out, analyze. Ideally, you would want some form of status within your CMMS that aligns with each of these stages so you can track work through the process. You can manage your process effectively. You can see where the bottlenecks are. You can see what's working well. The dates that we described earlier are captured visibly in your CMMS. The resources that you need to do the work are in the CMMS. So I think the CMMS is essential in some form or another for maintenance-intensive organisations to know what the demand is, and then that's how they manage the demand. So if you don't have an effective CMMS, you don't have effective work management. And similarly, if you don't have effective work management, you can't have an effective CMMS. I honestly think it's hand in glove. Like you can't have one without the other.
Right. In your years and years of work in the field, could you share one or two success stories where companies, effectively came out of a situation which having a like excessive backlog to a good state?
Yeah, so I mean, every client we've helped basically went through that in some way. So we normally start that clients will have a considerable backlog. They may not have clear backlog definitions, so they don't know what their backlog's actually telling them. They don't have cleansed backlogs, so they don't know what's in it. And they don't really have an effective work management process that means they're doing the right work at the right time for the right reasons. So anytime we've engaged with a client, even if it's just an assessment, we'll be telling them your definitions are out of whack. You don't know what your risk is, for example. But when we've engaged with them, we've worked with clients that have had hundreds of thousands of hours of backlog, and we've went with them. We've redesigned how they're going to prioritise their maintenance. So this is how you define what the key risk date is, and this is what it means and how it matters. We've reassessed all the work, so we've taken out the stuff they don't have to do anymore. You okay?
Yep, I'm good.
We've taken out the work they don't have to do anymore. We've built a schedule they can execute, and they start getting top of their backlog. So we've went from organisations that have got 100,000 hours, and they're now dropping it down into they've got 5,000 hours of unassessed, and they're trying to trend them further down. So almost every organisation we work with has in some way massively improved its backlog as a result of the work that we've done, whether it's reassessing it, closing it out, or managing to execute it. I mean, we've worked with companies like Repsol, CNOC, Spirit Energy. Yeah, so we've the implementation of maintenance and work management is what gets on top of backlog. And we also work with the OE UK. So the reason I could talk about backlog quite extensively is obviously the world went through COVID and maintenance backlogs in oil and gas went just skyrocketed because they couldn't get people offshore and there wasn't the ability to execute them. So we came at the back end of it, and the health and safety executive says, look, this is getting a little bit out of hand now. So it became an unacceptable level of backlog across the North Sea basin. It was high before, and now it's just unacceptably high. So they reached out to OEUK to get a group together to start tackling the backlog across the industry. So they didn't have a common backlog metric across the North Sea that everyone universally bought into and understood prior to 2000. So back to what we were saying at the start of this chat, the terms of original key risk date, latest key risk date didn't exist as a universal, this is what we call backlog. And that was the same problem for the regulator. So the regulator would go to an organisation and say, what's your backlog figures? And they would give them one thing, and another organisation would give them something else entirely. So this can be things like, do you include your deconstruct hours for building a scaffold? Do you include that in your backlog or do you not? Some would include it, some wouldn't. Things like that. So because there wasn't a common term, it was impossible, A, for everyone to understand where they were in relation to everyone else, and B, it was impossible to share best practice with everyone else because one person's backlog was another person's forelog or whatever. So basically, one of the big successes we had is we worked with the industry to actually get an agreed set of KPIs that were signed off by every operator in the maintenance backlog task finish group that they said, right, that's the yardstick that we'll use. And that was a painful exercise to get 10, 15 maintenance professionals in a room and agree the colour of a wall. It's challenging enough to get them all to agree what they would accept as the term backlog, what they didn't like about the new definition but would accept for the purpose of getting a common definition, and actually getting that in place and accepted and endorsed by the regulator. And it's now became the common term that everyone's using in the industry. That was a massive win for us because beginning to actually get that definition there. And it was so positive to receive. We're actually now writing the OUK backlog guidance. So we started by saying, here's how you define backlog. And then they reached out to us and says, can you start giving us some guidance on how to reduce it? So this is our guidance. So we're giving them guidance as an appendix to that document for how they write a backlog reduction plan. So that's one of our biggest successes, is really getting the topic clear, understood, and then giving the tools for people to get on top of it themselves as well. So we've done direct success within operators. We've got an individual operator's backlog down, but the industry-wide efforts that we're making, I think, are where the real benefit sits for oil and gas, if that makes sense.
Right. And in your view, do you think more than 50% of the companies following an assessment like that continue to efficiently use the work management practices to keep it contained, backlog?
So, no, it depends on the effort they put into to sustain it, if you like. So one of the things that does frustrate us a little bit from an SRCN perspective is we are implement mostly. So in terms of the design, implement, sustain, we are the implement phase. We're not normally here's a 5-year journey to sustain. And the history of work management improvement across, again, the North Sea Basin is one of essentially a sawtooth approach to it. So everyone puts the effort into it and then it just drops back off and then goes too far and back up again. So in the step change that we make, it's always positive. So we always get positive step change in performance. We almost always get recognition from the people we're working with that it makes their lives better and easier. And that's from maintenance managers to technicians to OEMs to executive leaders. Everyone is normally really positive about the positive impact because they understand the problem, they understand how to describe it to each other, and they can begin to talk about the things that they need to do to fix it and then deliver them. So in the short term, I think we are at 100% of a positive impact. In terms of how well they sustain it, I'm reluctant to give a percentage, but I don't think it's as high as I would like because it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's a lifestyle change, fit for life, not a fad diet. And I think one of the unfortunate things is work management isn't all that sexy. It's not an AI tool. It's not a single fix. It's you have to have discipline. You have to, and that's the challenge for improving work management sustainably is you need that thread of discipline throughout. You need to not compromise on it at any point. Otherwise, it just goes again. So you can't not work out and stay fit. So I think in terms of having sustainable, I do think that there is work to be made in every organisation to really put the effort into how do you sustain it? How do you make it that it's the way you do things? It's not just something else you do. It's not just a project. It's the new way of doing things. And I think that's mostly at the leadership level, is that the senior leadership will get distracted and begin to focus on other things or want a new initiative or a new strategy to implement because they think this problem's done. And it goes, well, it kind of is, but you've got to keep at it or it'll come back. And I think that's where they fall down a little bit. So the immediate benefits, universal, and there always is. Trying to get it to stick, that's the next part of our challenge. Is how do you genuinely get them to make it sustainable themselves?
Right. Okay. So as a closing question, Colin, do you see any trends in the industry, let's say energy industry, with respect to backlog or in and around backlog, which makes things better or even worse? Or do you
What
see
do you mean
any
by a
trends
trend that
around
makes
that?
things better? Do you mean is the outlook positive, or is there
Yeah,
adoption of things?
in terms of adoption, in terms of the recognition, in terms of people, seeing the backlog is for what it is.
Interesting time to ask it, because I think we're on the cusp. So I think there's been an extremely high amount of focus on backlog. And again, this is very oil and gas centric, I guess, in a lot of ways, because where the bulk of experience is. Over the last few years, there's been a real focus on getting backlog down. So there was the initiative we were involved on with the OUK. There was a real focus from the Health and Safety Executive. There were parliamentary questions appearing on the topic. So it was very much a point of focus. And you can see that reflected in organisational attitudes to backlog. So it was discussed at boardroom level far more than it was in the past. Will that trend continue? This is a really sticky bit. So, like I say, it's a sawtooth metric over the last. If you're to trend it over the last 20 years, it'll climb, intervention drop, climb, drop, and that's the way it's been. Every time you're on the drop, you think it's always going to be like this. So I don't know if you know any friends that have been in that cycle of they get really fit and then they think I'm always going to be fit and then they fall back off again. We're kind of at that point. So we're at the point we're quite fit. I think there's further work the industry can do to get better. But it's essentially, it needs a continued focus, and the focus is going to drift. And what I'm not sure about right now is will it drift or will it not? Because there is going to be a temptation to think we've done it now. Right, that's it, sorted, on to the next thing. I'm not entirely convinced we're sorted. So part of the challenge is the reporting across the industry is done by those participating. So they don't submit raw data to anybody that then calculates what their KPIs are using the raw data. So the OUK, for example, will reach out to operators and say, can you tell us what your backlog is using this metric? And then they will get sent back what the operator thinks. They don't see the raw data, they just see the reported figures. Is there the potential for some slippage in there in terms of, well, we'll tweak that a little bit so we don't look quite as bad? Or do they misinterpret it so things are coming out? That's going to be there as well. So I think we've made some step changes in terms of common definition, reporting is more standardised. Is there further work could be done to really get on top of it? Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Even if there's no further work done, will we stay at the same level? Right now, I'm not confident, if I'm honest, because I think focus shifts. So I think we're in a positive place. What I'd really like to see now is the continued effort to maintain it. Ideally, keep the trend going down, keep us getting better, keep continuously improving. But as a minimum, let's not bring it back again. I am concerned that we are going to just tip back over. And it's interesting, given the state of the industry right now. So it's facing real challenges. And again, I know you're not just oil and gas, so apologies for being so specific. But part of the challenge is that the industry is in a really difficult place just now. The governmental regime or the tax regime doesn't make it a very attractive place to do business right now. That means spending money in the region is unattractive. And if you've got a global portfolio, spending money in the North Sea, basically you're going to invest $1 here to get $1 back. If you invest somewhere else, you're investing $1 to make $10 back. So you're already fighting to get the investment in the North Sea in an unattractive way. That can start leading some really difficult decisions to make. So if you've got a very old asset that's very big and isn't producing very much, but is expensive to maintain because it's a big asset, you've got a lot of physical real estate and equipment you have to maintain, that's not a very attractive business scenario. You're spending a lot of money to get not a lot of oil. And if you're not making a lot of profit, the way you keep your head above water is to try and spend less money because oil's not going to go up. So there is the danger right now that you can begin to drive investment away, and there's the desire to underinvest because it's the only way to make it economically viable, or you're shutting the asset in and paying massive decommissioning costs. I think we're at a cusp. I think we're at an interesting point in the industry, which is it's quite an old industry. There's a lot of old assets. They still need maintaining, and you don't just want to shut them off because you ain't getting new ones, particularly the current environment. So it's an interesting time just now for the industry. Do I think backlog's cracked and done? Not convinced, if I'm honest. I think we've got a lot of work to do, and I think the awareness of it and the awareness of the decision making around it is almost more important than it's been, because there is such a temptation to make the problem go away. And I don't know if you've read it. The Health and Safety Executive recently published a process safety leadership assessment. I think it was in the last week. And what they said in the report was the industry has got a normalization of deviance. Within it, we've accepted backlog. It's just there and it's never going away. And it's just become part of the norm. And that normalization of deviance means we've normalized accepting this significant risk. So that is a pretty negative place to be in as well, particularly in relation to backlog. So a really long answer to what was a simple question, which is I think we're in quite a positive place in some ways. I really do think we're in a fragile balance that the temptation to go back again as focus shifts is really, really high. And I think unless there's continued effort or an intervention made to keep the focus where it needs to be, that's where we're going to go. So that's what we do. That's what we're trying to do our best at SRCN is post constantly about it on LinkedIn, talk to clients about it, engage with OUK about it, try and go out to other industries and see what they're doing and make sure we can bring those lessons back because we've got to keep on top of it. Otherwise, it's not good for anyone, basically.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Colin. I think I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. It's very thought-provoking as well. A subject I think we can go on talk about hours and hours, isn't it?
I'm fairly sure my ability to talk about it would vastly outstrip your ability to listen to it. You've got me on a topic I care about. So
I personally clarified a lot of things which I asked questions which has been bugging me for years, actually. So
no problem.
I hope it has been enjoyable for you as well.
100%. Anytime I get to try and talk about this topic and expand awareness, even if it's just yours, that's a win for me, Deepal. So if it goes no further than me helping you understand better, that's well worth an hour of my time.
Thank you very much, Colin.
Good man. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. I hope you enjoyed the conversation today. If you weren't already, I'm pretty sure by now you have a good understanding of why management of maintenance backlog matters. For future episodes, if you have any specific topics that you would love us to cover, please drop in a comment and we'll pick them up. Thank you ever so much for tuning in. I'll see you next time.